I have a very, very special guest and good friend on stage with me. So I don't want you to be dazzled by her sparkly shoes, but we're going to get into the private sector a little bit. Not only just about the Barbie vans, but the woman sitting next to me is Jeannie Renné-Malone. And I'll let her explain her title and her job in a minute. But in a former lifetime, Jeannie and I were in the trenches together at VF Corporation, which is a holding company of a bunch of iconic outdoor industry brands. Now, the joke that I always used to share with Jeannie with respect to the intersectionality of natural resources, a lot of the conversations we've had this morning, and all that fun gear that we all love. Don't deny it. I've seen some puffy vests and some really slick shell jackets in the room. If there's no place to go wear that puffy jacket, then it just doesn't make sense to make the puffy jacket. So companies like VF Corporation, which again is a holding company with all these iconic outdoor industry brands, that balance of tension, understanding how to facilitate the sophistication of supply chains, the sourcing of materials, the protection and the promotion of the natural resources that where a lot of these products are leveraged within, that is Jeannie's world. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome to the stage, Jeannie Renné-Malone.
What a nice introduction, Luis.
My pleasure, Jeannie.
And I just want to say thank you so much for the introduction to be here today, and congratulations on your exciting new role.
Thank you.
Continue to fight the good fight for the outdoors.
We just had a private sector, public sector conversation behind the little podium back here, like who's doing what and why. Jeannie, tell us a little bit about your job, because on any given week after you and I would get off of a call, I'd always sit back and just be exhausted by the amount of things that you have to watch over and pay attention to in your world. So talk to us, share your title, that'd be great, but also talk to us a little bit about your world and the things that you provide overwatch for.
Sure. So I am Vice President of Global Sustainability at VF. As Luis mentioned, we are the parent company for 12 outdoor activewear iconic brands such as Vans, the North Face, Timberland, Smartwool, and others. And in my role of managing environmental sustainability for the organization, if you just put that into just start thinking about what that means to a company of our size. It's pretty massive. We have 12 brands. We have a very complex supply chain, 35,000 people around the world, millions of people that work in our factories to produce the products that we wear. And my job really is to drive the collective vision and strategies toward minimizing our impacts on our planet, with positive benefits to communities and people. So I really bucket it into three different categories. One, we reduce the impacts across our direct operations. So those are like our built environment, our offices, our retail stores, our distribution centers. And that's no small feat, because that's things like putting rooftop solar on our own operations, operational efficiency in our offices. And we also look at the health and well-being of the people inside the building. So how do we design our facilities to think about the wellness of the people inside? The next bucket is our supply chain, and that's massive as well. And so we work with our suppliers. We don't own any of our own manufacturing, processing, production, but we do work closely with our suppliers across our different tiers of supply chain to help them minimize the impacts of their factory operations. So these are all over the globe in places like Vietnam, Mexico, Honduras, Indonesia. And what we're trying to do is help them understand their environmental impacts, look for ways to minimize those impacts, and all that translates into our greenhouse gas emissions and public-facing targets. So I can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But there are so many opportunities around our supply chain, and I've been to factories where we've helped some of our suppliers install rooftop solar, and it's so exciting to see how that domino effect can really help catalyze the industry in thinking about what we can do collectively to improve the operational efficiency of factories across the apparel sector. Now, the third bucket of the categories I was thinking about earlier is materials and products. So you think about the materials that go into our shoes, our jackets, our backpacks, our socks. The majority of that comes from the land, from agriculture. So another connection to why do we need to protect the land? It's because we need those natural resources to go into our products, cotton, wool, rubber. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but when we think about improving the material composition of our products, it really is thinking about those material substitutions that are better for the environment, better for the people that are handling those materials from a chemical perspective, and really at the end of the day, help us make progress toward our public facing goals.
Yeah, Jeannie, in mentioning all of that, I do want to point out, and I'm going to toot your horn because I know you won't do it. That VF just won an award with respect to regenerative agriculture. I think it was the Fortune 2023 list of companies that changed the world. I'm Let's hear it. I hear a little bit. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think when you wear that North Face jacket or you wear those smart wool socks, and some people actually showed me their smart wool socks. There you go. Thank you. Showed me their smart wool socks today.
I love it.
There's this sense of pride around the brands. There's a sense of pride around some of the things that VF does. So it's clear that regenerative agriculture is not just a buzzword or trend for VF. Or the brands. So why is it so important? I mean, you sort of mentioned it, but in the context of strategies for scaling this approach, supporting farmers through the transition, you're a company that makes stuff. How does that translate to talking to a farmer and saying, hey, if you want us to take your product, we need to find a way to do this differently? How does that work?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'm so happy that you were able to see Peter earlier in the trailer for one of his films. And we had him at our office one day, and it's just so moving. And it's to really see the work in action, I think makes a big difference. So glad you had the education on regenerative agriculture. I don't have to explain what that means. But for us, it really ties back to our science-based targets. So back in 2019, we set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets across our entire enterprise. So not to get too in the weeds on this terminology, but we have a reduction target for our direct operations of 55% by 2030, and for everything else, our scope 3 emissions, a 30% reduction by 2030 as well from a 2017 baseline. So to really understand what all that wonkiness means, we looked across our entire business to understand where do our impacts come from. And we found it's from raw material extraction, processing, and production. So really materials and factory operations, a lot of what I was talking about earlier, where we spend our time and focus. So when we think about material substitution, that's just tying it back to regenerative agriculture, we really have two pathways. One is to increase the uptake of commercially available sustainable raw materials. So that's switching out from virgin polyester to recycled nylon. The other avenue is creating our own captive supply of sustainable raw materials through regeneratively sourced materials. So when you think about, when I said earlier, the cotton that goes into a t-shirt, or the rubber that goes into our vans, or the leather that goes into a Timberland boot, all of those are coming from the land. And we have the opportunity to work with farmers, ranchers, and growers to help them understand the benefits of switching from monoculture practices to sustainable regenerative practices. And that actually translates into us getting a carbon benefit when we do our calculations to understand how we're minimizing our impact on the earth. So we work directly with farmers and growers and ranchers to help do this conversion, and then we're able to source those materials into our products. So back to the award that Luis so kindly mentioned, this was based on a pilot that we started in Thailand a few years ago to help a cooperative of farmers convert their land from monoculture to regenerative for their rubber plantation. And it took a bit of time and education to get started. We found an on-the-ground partner to really help us. And now we've been able to grow these cooperatives to other parts of the country to focus on conversion to regenerative agriculture. I've had the opportunity to be there, and probably you saw from the movie as well, to actually be on an agriculture spot that has converted to regenerative, and then walked 5 feet away to a monoculture plot of land. It's really inspiring. You can just sense that the air is cleaner, that there's more flora and fauna. You can hear the bees buzzing, and the farmers receive so many benefits from an economic diversity, because now they have the opportunity to source or to sell honey or fruit in addition to their rubber. So all that to say, the reward or the award was really, the result of the benefits that we all share between the farmers, the land, ourselves, and being able to source materials across 3 of our brands, the North Face, Timberland, and Vans, that really have so many multiple benefits. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this is going to sound like an easy question to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
I like easy questions.
Well, is the return on investment of this work worth it for VF? And I'm saying that because I know you and your ninja team would go up against the wall of, well, we're, a publicly traded company is responsible for driving that shareholder value. So, the return on the investment, is the work worth it to VF? And does the size of company matter to be able to do these things at scale?
Yeah, great question. I mean, from a return on investment perspective, we look at this long term. We're making these initial small pilot investments to be able to scale over the long term. And we're a big company. We have a lot of brands. We have a big supply chain. And so if we can make this work for us, then it's going to make it work for the entire industry, is what I think. And beyond. We would love to start partnering with the tire industry on rubber, the food industry on leather. So there's a lot of opportunities to start small and then get us to a scalable place where the pricing actually works out quite well. So the answer is yes on both.
It's worth it. Okay, I kind of figured. So where do you see the fashion industry with this adoption, regenerative adoption in 20, 30 years? It sounds like you've been talking about some of the key enablers in this space, which I get. And the conversation in Europe, if you wouldn't mind talking about that a little bit, because I know you and I would riff on that with respect to circularity, how companies and brands now are responsible not only for building the thing, but talking about where the thing goes to get recycled, and then how you're going to use pieces of the thing to make the next thing. And it's moving from a suggestion into legislation in certain parts of the world. Can you talk about how the industry is dealing with that and where you see it going in the next couple of decades?
I like how you just described circularity with
The
the
thing.
thing.
Yeah, whatever the thing is.
That was great. Yeah, so there are a number of drivers in addition to having our own just corporate goals that tie to our brand, consumer promise around environmental stewardship. But there's the regulatory pressure that's facing us, and that's very real and happening. Hopefully, you all saw the announcement that Governor Newsom signed into law 2 important climate bills in California this weekend. So we were very much part of that from an advocacy perspective. And we do the same thing in Europe, where we're seeing all sorts of proposed legislation related to circular economy. And so it really comes down to producers like ourselves and what is the expectation and the responsibility at the end of the day to take care of what we put into the environment. So whether it's packaging or textiles or product, we need to start thinking more about product end of life. We already have a number of exciting initiatives around circularity. We have TNF Renewed as a great re-commerce platform if you're looking for a slightly used but perfectly good backpack, for example. There's a lot of work we're doing to already minimize our impacts through these circular business models of trying to reuse our own materials back into our products once we get them back into our hands, but really trying to repair them and keep them out into the public as long as possible. But really, to that regulatory driver, that is, it's a catalyst for the work that we need to do. And many times these requirements are that we include an increased amount of recycled content in our materials or packaging, or that we take care of end of life. So these regulations that are coming they're a little painful to navigate and get ready for, but at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do, and it's a catalyst for our industry to be on track with our goals.
So again, get your questions ready because I'm going to ask 2 more, and then we're going to turn the mics over to the audience. So if you follow Jeannie on LinkedIn, this gives you an idea of her superstar status. You'll see that she was rubbing elbows with Matt Damon at Climate Week a couple of weeks ago. I won't ask about how Maddie's doing, but I will ask you, with respect to going to Climate Week, what are some things that you saw that gave you hope in this space? Was it just a lot of circle talk, or were there actually tangible things that you saw and that you heard that made someone with your experience feel like the needle was being moved?
So Matt is doing great.
Great, good. That's good to hear.
He liked my Barbie Vans. So Climate Week is such an exciting week. I hope you all have the chance at some point to be there, where everybody is talking about solutions, collaboration, coalitions, what financing is needed, the nature climate nexus. I mean, I could go on and on about like the main points to pull out, but a couple of main points I saw is the increased focus on nature-based solutions, which is really exciting. So what we're working on in regenerative ag is ties right into that. Financing is critical, and our experience in that area is we've issued a couple of green bonds, and one of the categories of spend in our green bonds is carbon sinks, so regenerative agriculture. So again, increasingly this link between nature and climate. What are the climate goals that we have, but how are we solving that with nature-based solutions, and how is financing playing a role?
That's great. I think you just doubled down on two of my questions because I was going to ask you about the green bond. So that's good. So we're going to move it to the audience. We've got a couple of minutes, enough time for a couple of questions. If you've got one, raise your hand. If not, I could be up here all day with this woman all by myself. So anyone? Can't see. Oh, of course. David, it's coming to you. Hang on a second. Here it comes. Over your left shoulder.
Well, I saw this question asked a couple of different ways on the Slido thing. What do you do as a company of your scale to encourage your massive consumer base to think sustainably?
Yeah, great question. So all of our brands have their individual kind of consumer messaging to their consumer base, but collectively we have a couple of main messages we're trying to get across. One is to think about end of life and to think about circularity from the three main principles of circularity, which is durability, recyclability, and disassembly. So many of our brands now are considering that type of philosophy when designing our products. And so when our Dickies brand, for example, which I didn't mention earlier, they're built on durability. We want our consumers to be able to use these products for a very long time. Same with the North Face. I mean, how many of you in the room have had a North Face product for more than 5 years? More than 10 years? More than 20 years? More than 20 years?
Keep going.
Wow, more than 25 years?
Keep going.
Okay, so that's great. I saw a hand up there. I mean, I have some very, very old North Face stuff as well, and I think that's kind of the philosophy. Is we design product that we want consumers to keep it forever. We have very good warranty programs, so if it breaks down, you can send it back and we'll fix it for you. So those are kind of the philosophies that we're building into our consumer messaging. Creating the re-commerce platforms to make our products accessible at a price point to those that might not look for it on our regular website. So a lot of different kinds of things. And then of course, just the connection to public lands, to the outdoors. I mean, the North Face is so based on, how we want to protect the earth so our consumers can enjoy our products in the outdoors for generations to come, and really working with our athletes. And here we have one on stage with us right here
Former, let me just say former athlete.
our athletes depend on, snow, on clean air to be able to do their athletic feats. And so I could be on stage here for hours asking you about climbing Mount Everest multiple times. So.
Yeah, I wore North Face. I'll admit it. But this is truly, I'll piggyback on that question because we do have some on Slido. David, thanks for reminding me. And given the amount of time we have left, I'm going to take the one with the most thumbs up. So you mentioned sort of that connectivity to recreation, right? And the athletes. And a lot of times brands will leverage athletes to talk about some of these pieces. For those of you that don't know, Jeannie's a Colorado kid. She's one of us. And recreates just as hard as any of us, I would argue. What's VF and the brand's approach to responsible recreation is the question. Does VF have a role to play to encourage consumers to recreate responsibly? And so what does that mean not only in not buying a different color jacket every year, but how you actually get out there and live it with some of the products? Is that the brand or VF's responsibility?
I think it's a combination, and kind of goes to the question I just responded to of how we really message to our consumers about the importance of protecting the environment. We also have a foundation that Luis used to manage as well when he was with us at VF, and that's a fantastic place where we are giving out grants for some really exciting work to build urban skate parks or to help increase access to the outdoors to underprivileged communities. And so there's a lot that we're doing through our different avenues, whether it's corporate, our brands, our foundation, to really give the consistent message that we care about the environment. We know we're responsible for protecting it, and we're putting the pieces in place to do our part, whether it's recycling, upcycling programs or re-commerce or just sourcing the materials, working with farmers at the very beginning, protecting our workers around the world. So we are hoping that our communication's getting through and that our commitment is heard.
That's great. So I got a last question here, or I'll give somebody a chance to ask one live. 50-50. Anybody go? Oh, a microphone over here really quick to the front table. And then
There's the
Yep.
cutest little baby at the front table
does
too.
the baby have a question? Yes.
Wonderful.
North Face does make baby gear.
It's also on Slido, so you can ignore that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a question about equity and equality in this. I have a job, and I feel very privileged that I can afford to buy smart wool, which is I'm wearing that today. But for most people, spending $700 or a month's rent on a jacket or shoes or other products is, unattainable. How can we work to resolve that so these products are the norm and that they're also priced in an equitable way that the average person can afford them?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And we do think about equity in a lot of different ways, including price point. And I think some of the new programs that our brands are coming out with, like the renewed platform I mentioned with the North Face. So those are products that are priced at a discount because they're a secondhand product that's repaired, and so they're at a price point that reflects that. Smartwool just created a partnership with ThreadUp, and so now you can find a lot of Smartwool products. We just had a Smartwool drive in our office, and so all of those are going out to ThreadUp. So we're really exploring those avenues, and I appreciate the question because I think it's super important, and it's something that we'll continue to lean in on.
Well, gang, I said it when I was a part of the company. I say it now as a shareholder. It makes me sleep better at night knowing that Jeannie's in the fight on a daily basis at VF. So please join me in thanking Jeannie Renné-Malone for joining us.
Thank you, Luis.
Thanks for coming. And if you haven't seen the Barbie Vans, not to be a consumer, check them out as she walks off stage. So we're going to keep moving, and we're going to take a different approach. We're going to move from, speaking of green bonds and some of those pieces, into the finance portion of this whole thing. So how do individual companies change their internal processes to be more climate or nature friendly, to think about some of the innovations that are happening on the financing side? So Peter Stein's going to help lead a conversation with financial thought leaders on how markets and other financial tools can be leveraged to enable better outcomes for people, nature, and climate. Peter's the co-founder of the Conservation Finance Network and the International Land Conservation Network, and is the managing director at Lyme Timber Products. Peter, over to you.
We're going to try to cover what's usually covered in 4.5 days in a conservation finance boot camp. No, we're not going to do that. What we're hopefully going to do is give you a few things to think about as the field of conservation finance innovations continues to evolve, and what in the world, or which parts of this, or which areas of this should you focus on as part of the capital stack, layer cake, lasagna of funding and financing to actually deliver durable, nature-based solutions. So I have been doing this for too long. The socks I'm wearing are Smartwool socks that were created for the 50th anniversary of the Trust for Public Land. And I started working there about 49 years ago. So, but I left and I went over to the dark side and became a capitalist, or a number of my friends described me as sheep in wolves' clothing. Because it's really to bend capitalism a bit. And so Lyme Timber, the firm that I'm one of the managing directors of, has been involved in about 1.5 million acres of forest land conservation in the US and Canada. Every one of those investments was made in partnership with a land trust or two, or a national or regional land conservation NGO, and a state or provincial or federal agency. And we don't just invest in the land, we manage it, but we also durably conserve it. And most of the durable conservation has been through a mechanism known as a working forest conservation easement, which we will not talk about much today. this afternoon, but we've also been part of the regulated carbon market, so the California compliant carbon market, which is not perpetual, but it's a 100-year agreement to keep the stocking that was in place at the beginning of the carbon agreement to keep the density of trees, the amount of timber on the land at that level or a greater level over the next 100 years. The reason I mention these things, and I'm not really going to go into that one, is about 25 years ago, or well, 31 years ago when I joined Lyme Timber, probably for the first 10 years, everybody else in the forest land investment world thought we were crazy. Like, why would you sign up for this like 50-page agreement that lasts forever that would control what you can do on property and things like that? Well, maybe we were a little crazy 25 years ago, but now it's become more and more convention. And I put up this slide. These are just some of the private equity firms that are investing in, some people call it natural infrastructure, sustainable real assets, nature-based solutions, a lot of different terms, but they're gigantic. And I only see it growing over the next few years. So the reason that you might want to, well, I'm sure we can share the slides after this, but these are companies that you might want to pay attention to. Many of them are looking for the insights, experience, and community credibility that NGOs that work in local and regional areas have as partners. You also may be the pathway for public funding that can be leveraged into some of these transactions that these groups will pursue. And to give you a real example, this is very far away from here. This is the down east region of Maine. So we're about 2,200 miles from Denver. And this is a project that Lyme Timber was invited into a number of years ago, and it really was to acquire kind of the hole in the donut. So 1 million acres of conserved land was missing arguably the most biodiverse piece of that landscape, which was the 22,000 acres that's circled in red. The reason I'm showing this is I want to just show you what these various financing and funding schemes, kind of how they come together to deliver conservation, in this case, permanent conservation of those 22,000 acres. Had they not been conserved, think of the negative shadow impacts of not conserving the hole in the donut it would have had on the rest of the donut, so to speak. So our partner was a local land trust. We also had they and we had lots of other partners. I won't go through all of them, but carbon played a pretty big role. Carbon revenue through the sale of carbon credits into the California market on land that was already owned by the land trust was part of the funding that allowed the land trust to acquire this property after a conservation easement was sold to the state of Maine. A second carbon project was done dually between the land trust and Lyme Timber as well. In the States, we have an extremely complicated tax credit program called the New Markets Tax Credit Program. And a great community development finance institution was an allocatee of those tax credits. So they had them available to be used in certain census tracts that met the economic conditions for those tax credits, and this was one of those census tracts. So Lyme Timber's equity, meaning the capital that we could bring to the transaction, was levered by the use of those tax credits. And to make it as complicated as possible, Lyme Timber has too many tax-exempt investors like foundation endowments or public pension funds. So we had to find a taxpayer to partner with, in this case, a local bank, that used the tax credits and made a loan to us that reflected the net value of those tax credits. I'm not going to go much further into this, but I just wanted to show you how the different funding mechanisms that you're going to begin to hear about can be aggregated, put together to deliver durable land conservation. And the reason I didn't use a project that had the Nature Conservancy or the Trust for Public Land or the Conservation Fund, this is land trust that has 3 FTEs. So it's a small regional land trust. They had quite a track record. They were smart enough to invite us into the transaction, but they were, I just want to show that this works at the local regional land trust scale, not just with big national or global NGOs. So, Citlali, Shaun, and Kevin are my brilliant panelists. All the difficult questions will be directed to them during the Q&A session, including the ones that I came up with. Actually, we are sitting in the right order. So this is perfect. So take it away, Kevin.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you to the Salazar Center and for all the staff who have worked really hard to put on this great symposium. Even if I didn't get a brownie, I won't hold that against you. So the Nature Conservancy is one of the world's largest environmental NGOs. We have conservation impact in 79 countries around the world. My purview is the United States and Canada. I am the US and Canada Carbon Markets Director at TNC. I'm relatively new to this space. I joined TNC about a year and a half ago. And I guess maybe my path was opposite of Peter's. I came from the private sector, where I have about 16 years of environmental commodities experience, working on sourcing carbon credits and energy attribute certificates, primarily for corporate buyers who are using them in their decarbonization strategies and advising them on the use of those credits. So TNC has been involved in carbon markets for quite some time in North America. We have approximately 40 projects currently operational or in various stages of development. The vast majority of these are in the forestry space, specifically in improved forest management. And then in Canada, our Nature United team, which is a TNC, that's TNC in Canada, they have a project that they worked with the Coastal First Nations, the Great Bear Rainforest Project, actually 3 separate projects that operate under a single banner. So in addition to the improved forest management, we also have done avoided grassland conversion, freshwater wetland restoration, reforestation, and tidal wetland restoration and seagrass restoration. And those are projects that we have worked on directly, and many of them in partnership with other organizations, including some for-profit carbon project developers. So the work that we're doing here is really to try to push the market and demonstrate how we can create high integrity carbon projects that are generating high quality carbon credits, and to continually improve the science, the carbon science, and the practices, best practices for project development. And it's really those terms, quality and integrity, that are driving the conversation in the carbon market these days. This has always been an evolving market, as evidenced by the fact that the certification standards have gone through various changes over time, the different methodologies that are used. They undergo revisions. Some of them are sunsetted. New ones are coming along constantly to try to adapt to the realities of the market, new technologies, both in terms of carbon removal and also monitoring technologies. But really right now we're seeing just a tremendous focus and interest in carbon markets that really it's just unprecedented. In 2021, the market, voluntary carbon market, grew to about $2 billion in value, and that is forecasted to grow to $10 to $60 billion by 2030. And Morgan Stanley forecasts it growing to $250 billion by 2050. So as we see more interest in the market, see more money coming into it, this demand for quality, transparency, and integrity is really driving that conversation. And so when we move into what we consider kind of the voluntary carbon market, VCM 2.0, it's really about the need for these high quality projects high integrity credits to push this into its next phase and to really help to scale it. At TNC, we've implemented our own processes for controlling our project development. That includes a 2-stage project review committee, as well as some substantial hiring, myself included, on both our regional and global carbon teams to support our on-the-ground teams who are doing this work. And that is really, focused on any of the projects in which TNC plays a material role. So one example of an innovative solution is our Family Forest Carbon Program, which TNC implemented in partnership with the American Forest Foundation. This program enables family forest owners who own approximately 40% of all forests in North America, in the United States, to access carbon markets. Traditionally, it's a barrier for small landowners to access markets. Project development is very expensive. The ongoing monitoring and reporting and verification requirements are time intensive and also expensive. And so this really opens up that opportunity for those landowners to participate in the market. So under this model, landowners who have at least 30 acres of land and generally under 2,500 acres, which tends to be about the point at which a standalone carbon project can be viable, they are paid to adopt region-specific practices to, these are climate-smart forestry practices to increase the carbon sequestration on their property. So this is a practices-based payment system, which helps to remove some of the risk and the variability from those small landowners of participating in the carbon market and being fully exposed to variations in carbon pricing. This uses the newly approved dynamic baseline methodology under Verra, which is the world's largest carbon certification standard. And this methodology, which was developed by TNC in cooperation with Terra Carbon and AFF, it differs, I'll get a little wonky here for a bit. Under a typical improved forest management project, there is a projected or a modeled baseline that looks at historical practices on the land and projects what activity would occur in the future in the absence of a carbon project. Under the dynamic baseline, the carbon project, there are sample plots that are then matched to control plots in the surrounding area using a minimum of 14 covariates to ensure that you are tracking the performance of the project land in comparison to the properties around the project. So what this does is it removes the risk of incorrectly modeling and estimating what's going to happen in the future, which we all know is incredibly difficult. And it really adds a level of bulletproof additionality to the carbon credits that result from the project. So just a really great example, I think, of a project that we are working on that provides those high quality credits. And outside of what TNC is doing, you have integrity initiatives, which I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit later, including the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market and the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. You just mix up the words and the acronyms get all confused. And the other piece that we feel is really important, and not only for our work but for the market overall, is trying to center equity into our project development. What does it mean for the communities where these projects are implemented? How do you provide access to these markets from communities who are traditionally left out of that? So one example is a project that we are working on in northern Minnesota in partnership with the National Indian Carbon Coalition. And this is with the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, who last year reacquired 28,000 acres of land that were brought back under tribal control. They are implementing, thanks. And they are implementing a carbon project utilizing this new dynamic baseline methodology, which will be a pilot of that on a large scale property. And the carbon revenue from the sales of those credits will help to go repay the loans that were used for acquiring that land. So it's just one example of important work where carbon can play a helpful role in the land back movement, and just one small example of how we can center equity on that. And I will leave that there and we'll continue our conversation. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon. As I think everyone in the room knows that when Peter says, invites you to be on a panel, you just get on the plane and go. So thrilled to be here. It's terrific to be reconnected with a lot of old friends. And like many in the room, I did my time at the Trust Public Land and have now also gone to the dark side and be thrilled to be reconnected with all of you. I'm gonna zoom out a little bit and talk more about the stacking of funding and financing approaches, traditional, non-traditional, new and emerging, and how the private sector can play a role in accelerating a lot of this new capital into all the projects that we're talking about, nature-based solutions being at its core. I'm going to really center outcomes in a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about. And I'm also going to focus on three particular kind of themes that I heard throughout the day today. Leave no benefit behind. You'll hear that throughout here today. Funding and financing is design. Bring it to the front of the project cycle. And show me, don't tell me. And I'll talk about that at the end. And I, like everyone else, need to figure out the... Here we go. So quick overview of who we are at Quantified Ventures. We partner with organizations, municipalities, states, counties, watershed and conservation organizations all across the country to solve problems, environmental, health-related problems through financing, as well as policy-related outcomes and approaches. And we do this work all across the country. My particular area of work is focused on financing and funding for natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, in partnership with many of the groups that are in the room here today, and trying to bring and pull down as much capital as we possibly can to accelerate your locally supported projects. If we look in just Colorado, historic amounts of natural hazards, climate-related impacts have happened over the last 10 years. You can think about drought, the cost of wildfires, cost of rebuilding homes susceptible to wildfires across the state, flood impacts. Climate change is expensive, and it's more expensive to rebuild after than to be putting in capital and making investments before a disaster. And that's exactly what I think we need to be talking about here, is bringing capital to the front, thinking about how we're proactive. We heard this morning about the great work the federal government is doing and trying to be proactive. The new framework that was just released, it really does that and brings nature to the front, brings financing to the front as named objectives, and allows us to start thinking about proactive solutions to building healthy, climate resilient communities. But the good thing is, now's the time. There's billions of dollars available. We heard this morning about the federal programs, just a couple, $19.5 billion to help farmers and ranchers implement climate-smart agriculture practices from inside the Inflation Reduction Act. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law had $2.1 billion for ecosystem restoration activities and $3.3 billion for wildfire risk reduction. We're talking Bs, right? So this is an exciting time for us to be able to meet the moment. $44 billion for the state revolving funds, in addition to the annual capitalization grants that the Clean Water and Drinking Water SRF programs receive. And half of that has to be allocated to disadvantaged communities as principal forgiveness, or AKA free dollars. So now really is the time to start thinking about how we stack these funding and financing approaches to advance these priorities. And we do need to meet this moment. And we can meet this moment, as we've been talking about, with nature. Nature is core. Nature is at the center of how we're going to be able to extract multiple benefits, be able to have the community be able to take advantage of infrastructure that not only functions when it rains or overflows a CSO and is hidden underground, but allows us to think about green infrastructure above this ground as well that has community benefit. We need to build this pipeline of projects. One thing that we have found across the country as we're working really closely with conservation, watershed groups, municipalities is before a lot of this bipartisan infrastructure law money and the IRA money, everyone said, we just need money. Just give us money. All of a sudden now we had all this federal dollars coming down and the conversation has changed to, just hold on, I'll figure out what we need to do. Let me give you that project pipeline. And so really a lot of the work that we collectively need to do is assist communities, work directly with communities to build that locally supported list of pipelines of projects so that we can really start to access those federal dollars and state dollars that are going to be able to be funneled down to the projects that we need to do. We need to bring that money to the beginning of the process. We've also found that project shovel readiness, those projects are moving along. We need to get funding readiness, and bringing funding and financing to the beginning of the project when projects are just beginning to get scoped. Pre-development is that messy space that we need to be able to play in a little bit more, and we're doing that in collaboration with many community partners. We also need to advocate like hell for natural climate solutions across the board in all of the rooms that we're in. It doesn't matter if it's a transportation meeting or an energy meeting. These all can be nature-based solution meetings. And I think that's an opportunity for us to be able to access additional dollars. And I think this is really critical, and Lydia mentioned it this morning, was the addition of climate change and critical water infrastructure as included in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the National Green Bank Pool, of how now we can start to leverage adaptation and mitigation dollars. And what's at the center of that? Natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions really can play a role. And we see that as a critical opportunity to be working with all 50 states to take advantage of this new funding and financing approach and really leverage the private sector. One example of how we're trying to stack funding and financing. This is an example of 5 different funding and financing approaches that we're currently working on with a military installation in southern Arizona, Fort Huachuca, and their Sentinel Landscape program. For any of you who are not familiar with the Sentinel Landscape program, which is Department of Defense through their REPI program, works with conservation organizations, municipalities around military installations to make sure that there aren't any incompatible uses. Think bombing range and new condo development don't necessarily always go well together. So how can we think about stacked priorities for conservation, habitats of species concern, downstream water quality improvements, all through conservation? And so we're working with the Department of Defense on bringing additional technical assistance capacities to multiple military installations through the REPI Challenge. America the Beautiful Challenge, looking at long-term endowment funding for operations and maintenance after these projects are implemented at Fort Huachuca. Water Conservation Grant through the State Revolving Fund program in Arizona. They're providing water-based grants where we can be able to start accelerating programmatic investments, filling the additional delta of the free money to the actual project budget through low market rate financing through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, traditional opportunity of stacking the funding as well as the financing. And then finally, some water augmentation grants, and now we're also experimenting and trying to figure out how we can weave in some water smart funding as well. So there's no one silver bullet for how we actually get to push these projects forward. As somebody said to me the other day, it's not a silver bullet, it's more like a silver buckshot. And I think that that's exactly kind of the way that we need to think about this, is structuring and stacking. And how we're working with, and many of you in the room are working with a lot of your partners on the ground, is by thinking about how we can, as my colleague calls it, English to English translation. Let's think more than just, I have a stormwater management project, and then you Google in grants.gov stormwater management, maybe a couple things pop up. But if you start thinking about flood mitigation, water quality pretreatment, heat island reduction, way more opportunities come up. So that hand-to-hand work with communities to help translating to opportunity now is more critical than ever as we have access to these federal funds. And you can see all the other examples of how we're trying to translate work on the ground, where some of these projects on the left would never be considered a transportation project. Now we have Protect. Most of these are now transportation projects. And so translating and taking advantage of meeting the moment is absolutely critical. I can't go through a presentation without mentioning the State Revolving Fund. I wanted to mention that only 4% over the last 30 years of all the historic amounts of money has only gone to non-traditional or green infrastructure projects. Now is the time to start expanding the pie, and we're doing that with many of our partners on the ground around the country. As I mentioned, $55 billion for water infrastructure, $44 billion of that going directly to the SRFs. If we think about all this historic amounts of funding that's coming down, after this money goes away and we've put it all to great use and it's in the communities, the SRFs are still going to be around. Now is the time to think about how we start to flex the muscle, build the SRFs as a really true conservation financing opportunity. And watershed groups and conservation partners are the utility's best friends. If we need to build the pipelines of projects by working with all of you in the conservation community to show that the SRF can actually be a really historic amount of money for this type of work. And then finally, the areas of opportunity that we've been seeing, and I've been having conversations with all of you, financial innovation. We need to be able to build that capital stack. Identifying repayment streams is something that continues to become a topic of conversation. We need more examples. The show me, don't tell me. Project identification, let's build that locally supported pipeline of projects. Supporting local conservation and watershed groups on financing and funding and stacking. And then as well as driving demand. Let's remove the hypothetical, as we've had conversations with many of the states around the country, especially with the SRF programs, and we talk about what's the willingness to fund nature-based solutions, green infrastructure. All of them come back and say, we'd love to do that. We'd love to do it. Green infrastructure is top of the list for us. But all of a sudden we start stress testing some of these programs and we start putting non-traditional projects through, they rank at the bottom of the list, or there's engineering requirements that don't match up with a conservation or acquisition project. And so we're trying to find out where those regulatory and programmatic challenges occur so that we can build up these programs for the future. And so with that, appreciate the opportunity today. Thanks.
Okay. Well, hi. My name is Citlali Cortés, and I will be needing my slides, please. And also, disclaimer: I am not here as a representative of KFW. I came in on my free time, a lot of compliance reasons, so I can speak more outside the breadth of what I would be able to say if I was here as a KFW employee. So, KFW is, how does this thing work? This is the one in the middle. Thank you. Okay, great. Are they up? Not yet. Okay. KFW is the Marshall Plan Bank, the Reconstruction Bank of Germany. And now what we do worldwide, and so this is going to be a little weird because I will speak of the work I do for KFW, but I am not here as a KFW rep. So if we can deal with that, so KFW is a bank that has been doing development throughout its history. It was born as a development bank. And we have different branches. The one I work for is the Financial Cooperation branch, and we implement ODA money. ODA is Overseas Development Aid money throughout the world, really. And in Mexico, and I'm sorry, all my slides are in Spanish, but I think it would be a good context for everyone here to understand the kind of work that we do as a financial institution implementing ODA funding. So yes, I'm sorry, they're not in English, but anyway, we do have, this is our current portfolio in Mexico. We have, I think about, 380 million euro. And it's very interesting to see that side of the slides. I don't know, the right side, I guess, for you, or left, or whatever. That side, the one that says Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales. That is a part of the portfolio that I coordinate with teams in Germany. And we do have a pretty hefty set of investments. It's a very diversified portfolio. We have grants. We do grants, and these grants can be implemented as sinking funds or as endowment funds. And we have our great partner here, Fondo Mexicano, that they manage both our endowment funds and some sinking funds too. But I also want to point out that project right there, ProInfor, that is a credit program that for us is a very small component of the portfolio. It's 30 million euro, but I think it shows the type of financial project that can be undertaken, thinking outside the box that we as conservation people tend to think of, which is more of the grant side of things, right? There's grant money, and then we have this project that works in a segment of Mexican forestry, natural forest management, community forestry, which is a very interesting model that works with indigenous communities and the ejidos. And I'm speaking of indigenous communities in our context of land tenure, right? So in Mexico, there is what we call the social land tenure. It's a layer that is not private, it's not federal, it's social. And we work with ejidos and indigenous communities that own forest and manage forest. And we fund through credit which is, as I said, it's a very small credit line. Interestingly enough, it's the largest credit line that has ever been implemented in Mexico for community forestry. So a very interesting portfolio. And then we have other investments in energy and transport and even a COVID program. So the next one, please. Oh, no, I can do it. Thank you. With a clicker? Maybe. Green. Okay, and then we have a bunch of other stuff coming up, which also includes natural-based solutions and primary sector type of work that we're still deciding how to approach it. Because as a bank, as a financial corporation, we do have to incorporate ESG standards. That's sort of part of what we do. I know it's kind of a bad word in the US, like to talk about ESG and stuff, but for us, ESG, right. So ESG to us is a very important element of our projects. When I started working for the bank, it was kind of I would not say a side note, but it was just another component of programs. And right now, our team, the team that is growing at the highest speed at the bank is the ESG team, and they look at things very closely. And I think it makes conversations definitely more interesting and more mixed, but I think it's a really good thing to have when you think of project design and implementation. And I will talk a little bit more about that when I touch on the forestry project. So basically, we're all over Mexico. The projects that we have in the green sector are these are the polygons of protected areas, and that's a large element of our portfolio. The ProInfor projects are not shown here because they're basically all over the country, mostly in Chihuahua and Durango, and in Oaxaca and this part of the world, where there's a very strong tradition of community forest management. And so these are some of our projects, very traditional type of work that KfW does throughout the world, working with protected areas to help improve their management effectiveness. So yeah, Sierra y Mar, and then we have FINAMP. Things start getting a little more complicated in our portfolio as we establish our presence in Mexico. These are chronological, I think, except for ProInfor. But anyway, then we have FINAMP. Also, a part of the project is a sinking fund. Part of the project is an endowment fund. And then now we have Cosmos. This is a very interesting project. This was just launched. We signed the contracts about a year ago, and the project was presented a week or two ago. And first, very cool thing about this project is that it keeps us in one region of Mexico, in central Mexico, super complex. This is where we need everything. This is where we need the heavy artillery. This is where things are happening. This is where we get a lot of people, a lot of industry, a huge need for natural-based solutions. Right here on basically it's a Mexico City metro area. I do not want to define this project as that, but that sort of helps set the context for it geographically. The oldest parks in Mexico, very complicated. You have all kinds of actors in the landscape. There is illegal timbering. There is pressure to develop for city growth. There's, of course, a huge need of water for the metro area, not just of Mexico City, but like the metro area of Puebla, the metro area of Toluca, one of the largest industrial centers in the country. So very sort of strategic way to approach a project. And the way we designed it is instead of having a revolt like, we call it a dispo fund. And the way this works is you give a certain amount of money and then you keep sort of recharging that fund. And the way we did this, which is an innovation for us as a very sort of traditional bank, is we set it to have 3 tranches. And so there's one big chunk of money that goes to Fondo. They invest the money and they use some of the money invested to pay for project management and those kinds of costs. So to reduce a little bit the cost of project management. The interesting thing about this project is that this was a carbon project. This was going to be our ship, thank you, flagship project for carbon in Mexico. We were so excited about it, but there have been so many political barriers to develop anything that has to do with carbon in Mexico that we had to put that on the back of the stove and take this money and use it as a protected areas money. And I think that for us from the south of the border, it's important to highlight this. I'm not going to talk about carbon because we don't have ongoing carbon projects in Mexico. It's a very political discussion that has to do with, I think it's everything. It's our history, this sort of, rejection of principles that are purely about a market approach. Mexico does not like that. Mexico was very emphatic about wanting to have more regulation, wanting to have a heavier say from the federal government on anything that had to do with carbon. So this is one of the lessons that we learned when we were negotiating this project for like 3.5 years, and then we had to can it and turn it into a protected areas project. So interesting lessons learned from the international perspective on that. And then we have Proinfor, which is this really cool project. This is what we call a concessional credit. It means that we took money from the German Ministry of International Development, and we use that to subsidize the credit rate that Mexico gets. And this was signed with one of the development banks in Mexico. It's been a very steep learning curve. And in order to fulfill our ESG requirements, what we did is we looked at different certification schemes to see which one would fit our requirements. And we found out that FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, was solid enough. And so we don't do any, we do follow up, of course, on how projects are being implemented on the ground. But by having a credit project, FSC certified, or a forest operation that is FSC certified, we know that those forests are much better managed than the rest of forests in the country. And that gives us enough tranquility to say, okay, we will fund this with our credit line. So we used FSC as a proxy to fulfill our ESG internal requirements. And we do work in tropical forests. Again, this is not an easy project. In the bank in Germany, people don't really like it because it's been very slow to disperse. But I think it's a really great hope for the future. A really good approach to funding these kinds of enterprises that need the money, that will not get subsidies anymore. Give them credit lines that will allow them to improve their standards and to make good use of the resources while improving their life. And with that, I think I'm 1 minute over time.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, some of your questions. For Shaun, I happen to know the answer to this, but I'm hoping, well, I'm sure someone sent this in because it's right here. Is Quantified Ventures thinking about Canada or Mexico as other geographies it might work in?
We have been historically completely focused on the U.S., but we have increasingly, as we've expanded our geographies around the U.S. and are now working in some of the border states, we have been having conversations with Canada as well as Mexico, and it's on the table. And we think that the approaches that are being developed can cross these boundaries, and especially if you think about the West with a lot of the water-related issues, they're intertwined. And when we feel like that's a terrific opportunity for us, and it's something that we're looking at.
One of the other questions was how do biodiversity markets differ from carbon markets? That's about a week to answer that question. But the really straight answer is, I'm not saying a forest is a forest is a forest, but we have one item to measure in a forest carbon project. In a biodiversity credit, we potentially have just an unbelievable number of items or issues to measure. So, if you just think of the Bailey ecoregions in the United States, that's 90 different ecoregions, more or less, where the biodiversity components are very different from one another. So if you're thinking about credits, whether it's for supply chain purposes, whether it's for remediation of other activities, it's just a very, very complicated arena. It's just beginning to be looked at in the US. There is a history of credits associated with endangered species that goes back 30 years, but that's a small subset of this market. But Catalina, what do you?
I think one of my colleagues here from Mexico is Alonso from the Biofin initiative. They are starting to think about how to talk about biodiversity with carbon. I think that in Mexico, and he might correct me he can correct me if I'm wrong. In Mexico, the approach is additionality. Use biodiversity on top of existing carbon credits. And I think that's sort of a safer way to do it. So there is a carbon market in Mexico. It's large, but it's all peer-to-peer. It's private. It's not regulated. And the federal government has made that case very clear. I think Fondo Mexicano also has a pilot project in the El Uno grasslands with carbon credits. There are a lot of other smaller companies or larger companies that are in that market, but that is totally unregulated and outside of the scope of what we do. But going back to biodiversity, I think that is a really good opportunity, at least in the Mexican context, to use existing carbon credits and somehow attach biodiversity like an additional value, because you already have the carbon in place, but they might have a different view here in the panel.
That's a good, Kevin, take it away on that one.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what we've seen is that biodiversity primarily takes the form of a co-benefit in a carbon project. And so it is kind of assumed to be a component of an NCS project. And the challenge there is that how do you actually value that in a meaningful way when fundamentally what you're purchasing with a carbon credit is a ton of carbon? As Peter said, a forest, a ton is a ton. It's not really, these credits are differentiated. What we've seen in the market has really been a move away from kind of standardization and commoditization of them, and this increased diversification of the attributes that buyers want from those credits. So as a co-benefit, you can drive additional value to the project. The question is that really being adequately valued or not? And can you command a sufficient premium in the market to justify that additional work? I do think also a core difference in the markets as they are emerging is that utilizing a carbon credit to offset your carbon impact is relatively straightforward. Using a biodiversity credit, as Peter said, very complicated and difficult to measure. What exactly would you be offsetting? How do you measure your own impact? And how do you get a like-to-like comparison? Probably more likely that a biodiversity credit would be more useful as a contribution type of claim rather than used as an offset.
Yeah, there's one, it's happened in Canada so far, but Verra, so VERRA, which used to be the voluntary carbon standard, but is the protocol that now has sort of a forest carbon plus. So they independently, third-party verify the biodiversity values associated. It has not happened yet, as far as I know, in the US, but it has happened a couple of times in Canada. One of the questions, because we're in the West, even though my example was in the East, but anyway, is the issue of forest thinnings. How we're treating forests to reduce forest fire intensity. How do you sort of square that with maintaining the stocking for carbon credit? That's a very simple one, so I'm going to give that to Kevin.
There is a wildfire protocol. I believe it's under CAR, and that is looking at the basically the projected benefit of that fire treatment in reducing forest loss from the intensity of wildfires. That is not something that we have been really looking at all that clearly. But I think this highlights a challenge with NCS, and it's not just with fire, it's also with biodiversity. There might be NCS projects where TNC makes a distinction between an NCS project and a carbon project and a carbon market project. A carbon market project can be verified and certified and actually create verified credits that can be traded. There are many NCS projects that will have a carbon benefit, but they won't actually be able to go through that verification process. And so that doesn't mean they're not worth pursuing, and it doesn't mean it's not worth quantifying the carbon impact, but differentiating between those two, because you might have some near-term carbon loss, for example, to promote ecosystem for biodiversity gain that in the long run will result in a greater carbon benefit. But in that short term, when you need to be generating credits to get revenue from the project, is not really compatible necessarily with a project.
We heard this, another one of the questions, we heard obviously from the first panel this morning, and very quickly and efficiently, Shaun shared some of the new federal funding, but how does a small organization that might have struggled with administrative and compliance issues a few years ago begin to address the complexity, and what role could Quantified Ventures play? This is kind of a softball, Shaun.
I like this one better than the last question. Thank you. So one of the opportunities that we've seen, and we've been developing a program called the Watershed Coordinator Initiative nationally, and we have a watershed coordinator in 4 different geographies, so Chicagoland area, I think Cook County, the 11 states along the Mississippi River, the state of Texas, and then the Colorado River Basin. And this whole initiative came out of that exact identification of a key challenge. Historic amounts of money coming down for the federal government, small community-based organizations as well as watershed and conservation groups, and a huge gap between those two. And so there's needing to kind of be wind at the back. So we've generated some really terrific foundation support, many of them are in the room, so thank you, to really develop this program of assisting conservation organizations in building that locally supported pipeline of projects. Adding a 0 to those applications will help them do that English to English translation, and then be able to kind of build that expertise as well as capacity along the way. And we've been finding that there are opportunities as we're writing these grants, working with these organizations, to include capacity in many of the implementation. It's a matter of how it's structured. And so not only are we looking to build stuff, we're looking to build long-term capacity locally. And so we're trying to prove out this opportunity of not just a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, but a long-term market opportunity of how we can partner directly. And if we do it well, Quantified Ventures sort of fades back into the curtains, and be able to stand up the states, the counties, the local organizations to be able to build that local capacity in partnership with many. So we're starting to see this concept really take off, and we're excited about the growth, and really that idea that I mentioned about stress testing projects to figure out where those barriers are really identifying where the opportunities are for additional funding, and that's where we really see the excitement of where this is going.
So one of the other questions that came in, besides forest carbon, what are the other carbon markets? We do not have time to go into all of those, but I would strongly recommend that each of you sign up for the weekly something that I get from the Climate Action Reserve. There are 24 active carbon markets in the United States. So whether it's landfill methane, it's just all over the place. Some may actually have relevancy as a funding source for some of your projects, but a great way to slightly keep track is the Climate Action Reserve. Great question. Let's everyone take a little bit of this. How do you see your work aligning with the ethical space considerations?
I'll start on that one. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the project I alluded to or spoke about earlier with the National Indian Carbon Coalition is an example of that, and our Nature United team's work with coastal First Nations in British Columbia as well. the difficulty is to not come in as a large organization and say, this is how you implement carbon projects. We have experience doing it, and this is the way to do it. It is to really engage in a meaningful dialogue and understand the needs of the community, their desired outcomes, and how that project fits within their own, cultural norms and traditions. And then to from there see if there's a carbon project that can be done from that. I think our Nature United team has been really doing a lot of great work with that. They are currently working on a community carbon accelerator program, trying to stand up a system that will help drive some low-cost financing to Indigenous-led projects to help overcome that initial barrier. So I think really what it comes down to is, how do you understand what the impact is going to be of the project in that place, and listen to the community and help them or listen to them and be driven by their needs and their outcomes that they desire from the project, and then work with that in the constraints of the existing certification systems that are out there.
I would echo the starting with outcomes is something that we've been really leaning on, and also understanding time and speed has been another one. Our private sector pushes a lot, and we're looking for action, but we also recognize that this work takes time to build local relationships, trust, capacity, and being comfortable with that space has been really key to getting to the outcomes that we're all striving towards together.
I guess as a bank employee, we always guide our work, again, by our ESG standard, which is constantly being reviewed. And part of that is FPIC, free prior informed consent. And that is a fundamental part of how we approach work when, with me, again, with my cap of the KfW Bank, we have to use FPIC process, which is understood differently. Luckily, though, Mexico does have pretty strong protocols about free prior informed consent and how communities are approached. And part of the discussion that was held in the country about carbon markets was precisely that: benefit sharing. How are communities, how are Indigenous communities, how are stakeholders being taken into account, and how is their opinion reflected on this? And unfortunately, we do have projects in Mexico under the current trend of peer-to-peer transactions that are not regulated, that are not necessarily guided through clear guidelines of FPIC and ESG stuff. So it's kind of cumbersome. Yes, it's a big part of, it introduces a lot of process into projects. And again, the private sector does want things that happen quickly and move quickly, but it's good to have that safeguard of a process in which communities are heard and listened and are part of the project design. And again, they decide whether they want to be a part of it or not. And so, I was talking with Alonso about this earlier today, about why Mexico opted out of the carbon, the federal government decided to stay out of that. And, there's a part of me kind of understands that because of the kind of wild world that is out there in the carbon, the peer-to-peer transactions.
Kevin just mentioned National Indian Carbon Coalition. It's a partner group or created by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. If any of you are from or working with Indigenous communities in the US, Brian Van Steppen is just a wonderful, warm person, and has just, he is Native American. He has figured out a really productive way to engage tribes, and quite candidly, he may spend 3, 4, 5 years just in the engagement process before a carbon project really begins to take shape. So I have great respect for their work, and we have a little project we're doing with them in Michigan, so I'd refer you to that organization. I think we have time for one more audience question. One, right here.
Oh.
My question is about the urgency of climate change and tipping points, and how can carbon markets align with that urgency? Because I have not seen the carbon markets benefits in the very short term.
You're 100% right. No, I mean, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. I mean, this is important stuff. Right, like methane, 30 times more impact. Yeah, yeah. So I think that we're working at the edges of climate resilience with things like carbon markets, but fundamentally we have to change human behavior.
Peter, you now get the award for being the bravest human being on the planet for contradicting Jen. So there'll be an award later on this evening. Gang, 10-minute break. When you come back, please pick a different seat than you're in right now. Change your perspective. Change your mind stretch. 10 minutes, gang. Come back 20 after, please. Thank you.